Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you everyone for being here. It's such a great turnout. When we designed this panel, we really wanted to think different. You've all gotten copies of the teacher pay report that we are discussing today. We've asked you to peruse it, but we are going to walk through the report. Instead of your typical, Jen gives a presentation and Abby gives a presentation and then suddenly time is up, we're going to walk through the report and have a dialogue first from a private sector perspective, and then we're bringing in amazing educators to bring into that conversation the education perspective. And we're going to start by walking through the kind of the key challenges that we found in the teacher pay report, and then transition into the conversation with educators talking about some of the recommendations. Part of why we're doing it this way is we really wanted to model what the Educator Innovation Lab, or the Innovation Lab, has always been about, which is civil discourse. You heard Walter mention it, you heard Leah mention it. When we roll out of this session, we are going into breakout rooms, and all of you are going to engage in a similar conversation. What do you like? What do you not like? What scares you? What messaging is interesting to you? So out of those conversations is where we have that generative experience of elevating the conversation about teacher pay, which we are confident, based on the policymakers and the staff members who are here, that everyone is really interested in having that conversation in the coming year. And we started with the private sector, in part because I think it's really interesting that when you bring up issues of teacher compensation, but also organizational structures of schools, to the private sector, they are actually really stunned. Private sector folks tend to believe that when they walk into a school building that they're seeing an organization that is structured like theirs. They assume that the compensation structure is structured like theirs. They assume that the principal doesn't have 50 direct reports, which Abby Smith put in a report in 2016 and sort of blew it out of the water, because when you talk to a group of business leaders and say a principal has 50 direct reports, their jaws are all on the floor. And compensation ties in with that, because how you structure your schools, how you pay the people within the tiers are important. So again, we start with Jen Mann and Abby Smith, both of whom have inspired Best NC's work. One is the furthest away. Abby's joining us all the way from California, and Jen's the closest because she's in the building next door, so thank you. But when Best NC started this work and we started looking at educator innovation, one thing we said is we want being a teacher to be one of the best professions in the world, right? And so when I say you inspired us, SAS is notoriously one of the best places in the world to work. Why don't we aspire to that? Why isn't that the goal? And making sure that every student has access to an effective educator happens if you're also making education that aspirational career. And then Abby, she works at Bain. She works in the education field, so she has her feet in both the business sector, the private sector, in a notoriously corporate organization, but working in education can bring to us a really nuanced perspective. And her inspiration for us was her report, again in 2016, where she really identified the challenge of lack of distributed leadership in schools, right? I mentioned the 50 direct reports, but it's more than that. It's how are we assigning people to be teacher leaders and not compensating them for that? How are we assigning people to be teacher leaders and not giving them time to do that work? And so you've both inspired our work. Thank you so very much. And here we are. I think we've actually, as North Carolina, made a lot of progress. And now is, as Walter said, time to move to the next level. So as we walk through these slides, I want to start by kind of grounding us in the problem. You know, it's easy to sit down and admire the problem and then get stuck, but we have to admire the problem for a minute. This is one of the charts that we use as evidence that students don't have equitable access to effective educators. If you're in a high poverty school in North Carolina, you are 3 times more likely to have a beginning teacher, and you are 3 times less likely to have a board certified teacher and twice as likely to have a beginning teacher. So a teacher who doesn't have that experience that we want to see for a professional educator in the classroom. That alone tells us that we're challenged when it comes to equitable access. So as business professionals, when you look at this, like, how does it feel if you bring in a professional who's 3 years into their career? Do you put them on the hardest account?
No, you don't actually. When I think about just our structure for our job families and the levels, as you progress through the levels, the complexity of the role defines the level. And so you progress and the work becomes more difficult. The supervision becomes less. So it's the opposite of what we would do in industry. We would put the most senior, experienced on the most challenging and difficult projects.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, when I look at these numbers, I think, well, this is what we have designed. What we've designed is producing this thing. And so I always think about, comp structures as a lever, right? A big lever in school, in education, to get done what we want to get done. And so this reflects what we've designed.
Yeah. It's perfectly designed for the results that we're getting.
Yes.
Exactly. And these are the results we've been getting for 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years. So then let's move on to, ultimately this is the goal, is to make sure that this is, that our students who need access to the most effective educators are getting, and all students have access to effective educators. But one of the challenges that we looked at was, how does the step and lane schedule that we've had for it, and designed in all the idea of fairness, but we've had it for over 100 years, how does that play out in terms of being able to earn a living wage? So we mapped out, you'll see this green line here is our current base state salary schedule. And this does not include local salary supplements, which are correlated with the additional cost of certain areas in the state, right? Wake County is more expensive to live in. Wake County has a large supplement, right? But if you look at the base salary schedule, and then you look at a living wage for a family of 4 with 2 incomes, let's assume both of those incomes are teachers, right? And we've mapped out kind of 2 paths, somebody who started maybe a little bit later, someone who started right out of college. You're having kids a few years into it. And we estimate that as much as 65,000 teachers are sitting below a living wage in that front part of their compensation. What does this tell you when you have employees who are having families and developing their career and really thriving in their career? What is this? How would you do this in your?
Well, let me first, something I wanted to say from the onset. I come to this conversation with a lot of humility. I don't even begin to understand all the challenges that you as educators and administrators are dealing with. Having 2 adult children, I can tell you right now that their teachers made all the difference in the world. They would not be where they are today, transitioning into careers that they're passionate about without the teachers that they had. So I am grateful to all of you for the work that you do and these crazy challenges that you're having to deal with. So I come from the tech industry. I've been at SAS for 25 years, and before that I was in high-tech manufacturing, so a different perspective. But I will say that when it comes to looking at pay practices that are based solely on years of experience, that doesn't necessarily drive the result that you're necessarily looking for. It's got to be a factor of many things. So when I think about the structures at SAS and in industry in general, you have job families, there are levels within those job families, and yes, there are minimum requirements of which experience, years of experience, education requirements are part of that. But the progression of a person's ability to move throughout there has a lot to do with their performance. And so, and then they cap out at some point. But typically that progression is faster earlier in their careers at the time when they probably need that more than later in life. And so I think that needs to be considered when you're looking at the structure of the teacher pay structure.
I agree. Abby, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and when I look at this, I really see 2 things. So one is just the length of time it takes to grow into that living wage. And I started out as a teacher. I spent time as a teacher, and I was in California, and I left because I wasn't making, I didn't have the language at that point, but I wasn't making what we now talk about as a living wage. And it just didn't seem like a viable profession. And so part of this is the length of time it takes to get to that living wage. And part of it is just that we're not paying people a living wage, and that's nuts. And Jen and I were talking.
Technical term there, right? One I use often.
Jen and I were talking backstage about, well, what are we going to say about this one? And it's just hard to know what to say, because this is a hard job. It is a really hard job, and it requires head, and it requires heart, and it requires dedication. And when you do a good job with it, you get fed by the results that you see, but that does not put food on the table for your children. And so, part of this is the length of time that it takes, and that I do think should be adjusted, but part of it is just moving the whole thing up.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to add just, over the years, regardless of industry, I've noted that there are three things that all employees want, really, regardless of the industry that they're in. One, meaningful work. They want to know that what they do each day is worth getting up for and going and doing. The second is they want leadership. They want good management and leadership that focus on them, develop them, has their back, provides resources for them. And then the third is to be rewarded fairly, and to be able to have benefits and total rewards that meet their personal and their professional needs. If any one of those things is out of balance, then you run the risk of not being able to attract and retain talent. You could have meaningful work and feel good about it. You could have a great leader, but if you can't put food on the table, you'll be forced to have to find other opportunities. And so I think this is one that we really need to figure out.
Yeah, passion doesn't put food on the table, as you said. I think Daniel Pink, who we cite often in the report, who wrote that great book, Drive, says before you even start talking about additional compensation, you have to get compensation off the table, right? And this, to me, seems like a really good starting point for that conversation. And then you talk about the other things that are important. I feel like there's almost been a myth fed to, that it's fed to maybe to the community that, oh, well, it's passion or pay. And again, one of the best places in the world to work, right? People here have passion. And if you're working in the accounting department, you love numbers and you love accounting, you don't love the for-profitness, right? You love what you're doing. So there's nothing wrong with being both passionate about your work and getting compensated for it. So moving on, speaking of kind of what people want in their compensation, this is a survey that really stops people in their tracks. This was a survey of top-tier candidates, top-tier college students. And they asked, what do you want to see in your preferred profession? And then, do you think that you'll find that in teaching? And what you see here is pretty much across the board the things that they really value. Now, there's a much longer survey. You're welcome to go to it, but these are the compensation-related ones. Are disproportionately not happening in the teaching profession. I don't need to tell the educators in the room, and about half of our attendees are educators, former educators, administrators, so you all have a great perspective on this. But everything from starting pay, which we just talked about, increases over 7 to 10 years, pays appropriately for my unique skills. But one that really hits us because of our work on advanced teaching roles is the concept of advancement. I want opportunities for advancement. Abby, can you speak to your work on those opportunities?
Yeah. So this work came about because we had done a fair amount of work on figuring out how to build better pipelines to principals. We know that there is really no great school without a great leader. But we observed that even in those places with great pipelines where we were finding great principals, we weren't necessarily being deliberate about how we were deploying that time, those people's times. And so this is where that research came, that we were able to demonstrate that the average principal in the United States has 47 direct reports, so almost 50 direct reports. 37 of those are teachers. And what that means is, in practice, is that those people really aren't being managed. If you're a fine teacher, you are left alone because the principal is busy putting out other fires and dealing with other things. And what that means is, if you're being left alone, is that you're not growing in your job. And you might, seek out coaching from an instructional coach in the building. You might have the teacher next door to you, which is what I had, who was incredibly helpful and gave me tips and hints and helped me get better, but that was, something that I found on my own. And so the way we've set up our schools is such that people aren't getting the feedback and, growth-oriented feedback that I think, as you mentioned, people want to feel like they're growing in their jobs. We did some work with a school district in California around their comp structure. And, we went in and the teachers were very unhappy. Districts in California figure out their own pay scales. Unlike, I think here, it's a state decision. And so this district was surrounded by wealthier districts, and those districts could pay more. And so they were just losing talent right and left. And as we talked to teachers, we did a big survey and we did a bunch of focus groups, and everybody said they wanted to be paid more. If you ask people, do you want to be paid more? They say, yes, I want to be paid more. But then we asked people, would you recommend your job to a friend or a qualified friend or colleague? And this group of teachers was very, very negative. And as a whole, they did not want to recommend working in this district. But then we started to cut the data, and we looked at, for the teachers who were getting paid more because they had more tenure, they had more educational credits, they were further up the step and ladder, we call it step and ladder in California, step and ladder pay scale, they weren't happier than the teachers who were at the beginning of the step and ladder pay scale. But when we asked people, how often are you getting feedback? Are you getting no feedback? Are you getting feedback once a year, once a month, once a week? All the way up. The people who were getting, it was a straight line, first of all, in terms of overall job happiness, satisfaction, willingness to recommend the job to others. The people who were getting, the teachers who were getting feedback once a week were actually happy in their jobs, right? And so this all ties together into this idea of if you have a principal who doesn't have the bandwidth to coach the people who work for them, then those people aren't getting any growth opportunities, and they're not going to be happy there. And no matter how much you pay them, it's hard to like that job. So this is all tied together into that idea of distributed leadership. And when you have distributed leadership, and then I'm going to stop talking because I could go on for a long time. When you have distributed leadership, you have differentiated pay.
Right. And we have two experts in distributed leadership. We have a superintendent and a principal from ATR schools. So we'll have that conversation some more. What do you want to add about this as you're recruiting and talk to your talent?
I was just going to say the challenge and what Becky just pointed out is not unique to education. We see this at SAS as well. The biggest impact on employee engagement is the relationship with their manager. And when we do an employee engagement survey each year, career opportunities, feedback from manager was an area as well that we needed to focus on. And so, we tell our managers, your 80% of your job, if not more, is to be talent managers. That's what the job is, and that's the most critical role that you can play is developing your talent. I mean, and it's very important to us at SAS. We do a manager feedback questionnaire each year that assesses our managers on the very topics that were just pointed out, and we have a net promoter score that we give to our managers so they can see how they compare against their peers, and we hold them accountable to that. It's really, really important. When I look at span of control, the industry in general says you should probably have no more than 8 to 9 direct reports. That's a lot.
So the answer is not just get the principal more into the building, right? That's what I'm hearing. And then further in your research was if you are a teacher leader, because that's then becomes the answer, you want time and money, right? You want, and you talked about how, Jen, how you earn more. It's correlated between sort of when you need more income because your family is growing or whatnot, but your professional growth is at its highest. But then you, like you said, you top out. And then you earn more because you've now taken on leadership responsibility or a harder client or what on top of that. And that's something, again, we generally don't see in teacher pay, which actually leads us to the next slide. 10 years ago, when the state was looking at the post-recession challenges of the fixed pay for 6 years, Leah Sutton can speak to that because she was hired during that and had the same exact pay for the first 5 years of her career. And they were using the examples from Jacob Vidger about lawyers and doctors that generally get to the top of their base pay in 7 years. The House had a committee last year, right, on sort of reimagining the profession. Representative Torbert, Representative Blackwell are here, and they had their fiscal research staff put this together, and this isn't private sector. These are public employees in the state of North Carolina who, guess what, get to the top of their schedule faster, right? And importantly, the teacher's line, not only does it take longer to get there, but it is lower, right? So again, if you can help us unpack this from your perspective.
I don't know how to unpack this one.
I mean, again, we're getting what we design. And I think what this is designed for is not to hold on to people at the beginning of their career.
Yeah. And you couple this with the challenge that you mentioned earlier, that you're putting earlier career teachers in the hardest situations. What does that turnover look like? I mean, we're running them away potentially.
Twice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that that's what you saw, right? That's exactly what's happening here. So again, this comes back to, it's a combination of living wage, and it's a combination of, in that top tier survey of getting up in your career in 7 to 10 years. I thought it was fascinating that was the frame that they asked for, because the research is really clear that that's the frame, 7 to 10 years. All right, so then let's talk about access in hard-to-staff schools. We looked at poverty as a factor. Now let's look at subject area as a factor. We examined UNC system graduates 5 years into their career, and as you can see, some degrees pay more than others, right? It's a fact. We know that in North Carolina, we have a teacher vacancy problem that's across the board. We know that we have fewer applicants coming in at all levels and in all fields, so I'm not dismissing that in any way, thus the conversation about starting pay and front loading. And we have a harder time filling certain positions, and it's kind of no wonder when a math major who their employer base is not the education field, it's the whole of industry, and they can expect to earn $9,000 more as a math major. And this is a very, very difficult conversation, because in the education space, it is rarely acceptable to have this conversation, but the fact of the matter is, and Leah had this in her slide, teachers who have to sit next to a vacant classroom are not happy, right? If you have 2 math teachers instead of 3, those 2 math teachers are taking on more burden. So this is an issue. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I almost hate to ask you about it because it's such a common sense factor, how much do you pay when you have to fill a position?
Yeah, well, so when I look at this, I think about the reality that market is market, right? So some jobs are just going to pay more. And even within SAS, we have different jobs. We have very diverse jobs. Not everybody's a software developer. So you have developers, you have marketers, you have salespeople, you have HR, finance, legal, and each job has a market pay factor that's based on benchmark data, right? And so if I wanted to be paid like a software developer, I should have gone into software development, right? I went into HR and I'm paid what HR people get paid. But there are critical skill sets, and even within our pay structure that's defined by industry structures and things like that, there are critical domain skill sets. So at SAS, if we're developing solutions that are for a particular industry like healthcare or financial services, we hire domain experts that come from those industries. Mm-hmm. We have to pay what that market pay is in order to get those individuals, in order for us to do the work that we do. So critical skill sets are based on the needs that you have within your organizations, and you have to pay the market rate for that.
You pay what it takes.
You pay what it takes. Yeah.
Abby?
Yeah, I mean, I see the same thing, and I also just see the importance of, if I think about the bars on the left-hand side of that slide, just the criticality of those subjects STEM subjects for the future of our students as they think about becoming competitive, and helping to drive our economies forward. It's critical for our country that we are continuing to provide a high quality education for our students. And so, there's two ways to deal with this. I think there's the private sector way, which is to say we have to pay more for the harder to staff positions. And I think there's I think that educators have typically not wanted to do that. And so fine, we got to pay everybody more if we want to get, if you want to have the physics teacher, you have to pay the English teacher more too, right? So there's two ways of dealing with that, but just what I see is the criticality of making sure that our students are receiving the education that they need to help continue to drive our economy forward in a competitive way.
Yeah, I had someone tell me last night I was talking to about today's event, and she's an educator, that there are 56,000 vacant math teacher roles across the country. That scares me.
That's entirely possible, right?
That's frightening.
Right, and basic math skills and accelerated math skills are at the core of 90% of all new jobs, right? So this is a economic imperative. It's a safety, in the global economy imperative, right? This is holding on to it because it's the way we've been doing it. It's not tenable anymore, right? So I appreciate that conversation, and I had a conversation recently, and the person said, "Well, I don't believe in differentiated pay, but some schools are harder to teach in, and we should pay more." And I was like, "Well, that's differentiated pay." So again, thinking about it as sort of how do we fill positions, and the military is notorious for, if they have a vacancy and they need to fill it, they pay what it takes. And and so it's not just that the private sector can do it. In the private sector, yes, you can probably be more nimble of, that position in that particular, finding an engineer in Stockholm is going to look different than one in San Francisco, whatnot. But we can at least tackle kind of the basics. We know that this is a critical vacancy. So I'm going to move on to an issue that we as women in the workforce are familiar with. This is complicated. I've never seen anyone else do this. Chris Palmer, who's our analyst, put this together, and I'm just so impressed with being able to visualize this challenge. If you look at incomes for bachelor's degree earning labor workforce in the United States, this is US data, not North Carolina data, over time, you'll see kind of why the workforce is 80% female, right? The women's is the bottom line in green. Teacher pay is the next line up there in the blue, with the lighter green is national average, and the dark black color is men's bachelor's degrees. I won't have a whole conversation about the difference between that top line and the bottom line, but right? Someone pointed out, actually, Richard Reeves has a new book about men and boys, and talks about how we need more male educators, that we're actually declining. We had 30% male educators a few decades ago, and I'd like to circle back to that. But let's just talk about women in the workforce. In a world where teacher pay sort of pulled from the female workforce that was earning less, and now, for the first time ever, teacher pay has even dipped below women's average income. Can we speak to that?
This one was a news flash for me, honestly. I didn't realize this until I saw this, and I'm still trying to actually process it. In an industry where we have fought so hard to get women into tech and to get compensation at the level of male counterparts, I cannot understand a profession that started with women and getting, I just can't understand how this has happened, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, this takes me back to that other slide we were looking at, where it showed that it takes 14 years to get to the, and I think about that because I think in your report, you had the statistic that, what was the percentage of women bachelor's degrees who went into teaching 50 years ago?
Half of women who left, you'll see that video this afternoon, half of women who left with a college degree, ended up in teaching.
Right.
That's where they went.
I went to Meredith, a teaching school.
Right.
So yeah. So
Right.
yeah.
And that is what our compensation structure is designed for. 50 years ago, we'd get women bachelor degree holders into teaching, and they would teach for a little while, and then they would leave and have children. And so why should we pay them a lot of money? Because they're not lifelong teachers. And so that's what that is designed for,
And
right?
it's a captive workforce.
And it was
Right.
assumed that it was secondary income.
That's right.
Yes, secondary income.
They were not the breadwinner, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know, I struggle with this one.
Rick Hess has this in his book. So again, you'll get copies of this book this afternoon in the breakout sessions, but he says the compensation model and the structure of schools was designed when women were a captive workforce, right? When people who today are chief executives of HR and partners at Bain and CEOs of a nonprofit, we would have more than likely been in nursing or teaching. Those were the options. And so if we want top tier talent, we need to start compensating like top tier talent. So yeah, I love that I don't have words for this. I think that's sort of the right answer to this. Well, so continuing on just with a few more thoughts, just sort of, I'm going to start with Abby on this. Just if you think about, and you do come from the education space and you do examine what other places are doing, is there anything you'd like to add to the conversation in terms of ideas?
Yeah, so I think there's two big ideas that we're talking about today. So one is, and Brenda, I think this is in your report, this is sort of raising the floor, right? Paying people a living wage. But then the second one is, all right, if we're going to pay people a living wage, how can we take the values that we have as a state, the results that we want to have as a state, and use our compensation structure strategically as a lever that it can be, as a very powerful lever that it can be to design for what we want to have happen. And I think that as we look across the country, we see various different models or ways of approaching that. So one is the step-in lane, which is the more traditional model. A second model that had a big heyday, I would say 15 to 10 years ago, is around pay for performance, which is a retrospective look back at what happened and paying more for results, for good results. A third way that we see a lot, which is less structural and less talked about, but is, I think of it as the throwing money at the problem method, which is we have great teachers in the building, they're not getting paid enough, we need to figure out a way to keep them. I've got some money in the budget, let's call it a stipend and give them a leadership role, but let's not actually ask more of them, right? Let's not give them more work because we're just trying to figure out a way to pay them more, right? And so that's sort of the stipend way of retaining our best people in the building, but it's not very structural and it's not very strategic. And I would say that we need a fourth way, which is paying people more to do more, right? So it's almost like a pay for performance, but it's a forward-looking pay for performance. So this ties into the distributed leadership and the advanced teaching roles. How do we imagine bigger roles that require more skill, that you have to work your way into, that we pay you more for, you benefit from that, but other people around you also benefit. And so if I think about if we have a team of 10 teachers and we have $10,000, we could divide that evenly and give every teacher $1,000 extra, which is great. But that comes out to, I think, $83 a month. So it doesn't, before taxes, right? So if we took that $10,000 and we gave it to a leader of those teachers, that's a real pay bump. That feels really different. And then we ask that leader of the teacher to spend their time not only teaching their own students, but coaching and developing the teachers on their team, then those teachers will also benefit from that investment in that teacher leader.
I like that. One thing educators will say when they hear that is, oh, you want me to do more? So I will also add that in advanced teaching roles, we're pretty emphatic about coming out of the classroom. So 50% of your time or 100% of your time, you are not leading the students, you're just leading the whole of the teachers and the students around you, taking away the responsibility of direct teaching every single day, 24/7, but teaching like 30% of your time. And the other is, in advanced teaching roles, we added, what if you don't want to be a leader? We all know, right? A lot of times our best teachers get 5 extra kids, or they get 5 fewer kids because that's the bonus that they get for being great. There are all these strange sort of odd versions of compensation of, oh, you don't have to have lunchtime because I'm, whatever. So what if we actually paid people for doing more who are already doing more? So it's a combination of how do we imagine these new roles that haven't existed that should, that we pay more for, and then also how do we compensate the people who are already doing more or willing to do more, and right now they're doing it for free, for fun. It's not good. So what would you add to that?
I don't know that there's a whole lot to add. I think you broke it down perfectly, the options. I think the only thing I would share is that, we don't have an infinite amount of money. So the way that you use the funding that you get is very, very important. We're no different at SAS. We get funding and we have to be very strategic about what we do with those funds. Otherwise, we're not going to get the result that we're looking for. Mm-hmm. So part of what we do is we analyze our data. We look at where do we need to fund to drive the results that we're looking for. You get what you pay for, and so.
Yeah. Well, a good example, Abby brought up sort of the 2 options, right? So if we were to pay math teachers a $5,000 stipend, which by the way is a fraction of what Alabama is paying for their math teachers this year, so Alabama, that would be about $250 million. $5,000 just for math teachers, right? Then you add in STEM teachers and computer science and whatnot. If we were to pay every teacher $5,000 more, it's $5 billion. Right? Do you think we can afford that? No. So at some point we have to have the tough conversation about how do we prioritize those funds. The things we're discussing today are well over $1 billion, but they are not $5 billion, right? So raise the floor, raise the ceiling, and be strategic about it. Exactly. We have just I'd love to invite, say, one question from the audience before we bring out our next speakers, and then I'll go through these recommendations. Any burning question? Representative Blackwell.
I'm curious at the SAS circumstance in state government. We have a teacher pay scale. The legislature sets it. In the private industry, where you've got diverse managers and divisions and so forth, to what extent is differentiated pay within your salary structure handed down from management at the top, and to what extent or how do you let local managers have a role in deciding whether the money goes to this one or to that one?
Yeah.
And is it an issue that you deal with having to do, if you try to do flexibility to the locals, that you get favoritism or at least charges of favoritism? People who want to say, well, I don't want to have somebody mad because I gave this teacher more and this one less, so we're going to do across the board. How would you all deal with that? How would you have us deal with it?
Yeah, well, I'll explain how we do it, and it's not unique to SAS. I mean, this is pretty much across the industry, and I'm on a board for a bank, and they're similar. So even in the financial services industry, it's very similar. So our pay structure, again, is based on market, right? So our jobs we subscribe to market surveys in our industry, so software industry, same size and revenue, and we get data on what the pay scales are within our industry. Our salary structures are wrapped around that market data. So we target the market median of our market data, and then we have a range, and employees are paid within that range. Where they sit within that range is initially based on their skill and years of experience and minimum requirements to get into the role, but then performance is a factor of that as well. So that's where the manager involvement comes into play. So we have, at the beginning of each year, we have corporate metrics that we must hit. So financial growth, profitability, customer success, and then employees have individual goals that they agree to with their managers, and that's the portion that they control, that their performance will be a factor of their progression within their pay scale as well as their incentive that they get, the bonus that they get. So a manager does have some level of discretion when they do that performance review against those MBOs, but those are already defined, they are measurable, we track those, so it's not just arbitrary. It is based on the level of the employee, where they are to market and their peers and their relative performance. And we provide guidance on that. So it's not just willy-nilly. We provide them with a scale that says if your employee is meeting expectations and they're at this level, this is where the range with which they should be compensated. And then we rerun analysis on it. So it's once they submit their recommendation, we do an equity review to ensure fairness across the group.
That would seem to make sense if you're dealing with an existing employee, but what if you're trying to hire a math teacher and it's tough to get them to come to Eastern North Carolina? To what extent does your local manager have the ability to offer more to get that person that he or she needs? Is that so long as they stay within the range?
Correct.
And then they ask permission from on high?
We recognize at SAS areas that we might need to be more competitive within that market data. So if critical skill sets that I mentioned, for example, domain skill sets, we might target the 75th percentile of the market data instead of the market median. So we provide that guidance, and so the managers have discretion within the guidance that we provide. But we identify the areas up front that we know we're going to need to pay higher to market because of the strategy that we're delivering on.
Yeah, and Abby, you've talked about how Bain's performance reviews are very similar to what we just heard.
Yeah, I mean, and this is another instance where I've noticed just along with the number of direct reports, just a real difference in education between the private sector. So, most of our private sector clients use some combination of objective measures and subjective measures when they're figuring out end of year pay. So there's a set of KPIs, and they're adjusted for the job, they're appropriate for the job. We use the same thing for us. So there's a set of objective measures, how much work I'm selling, what my teams think about me, the ratings that they give me. That all goes into to my pay. But then there's a subjective measure, which is the evaluation that I get from my supervisor and the evaluation that I give to the people who work for me. And I don't get to write whatever I want. There's a structure and there's a set of ratings that I give. But we trust the people who are our leaders to make those informed decisions. And that's something that I've observed is just a real tough thing in education, that idea that the supervisor, that the evaluation could change how someone gets paid. I think part of that is because there's just this underlying understanding that the principal has 47 direct reports and doesn't really have the time or the bandwidth to have the visibility into who's doing a good job. Right. So there's that's a real reflection of that. Yeah. But there's this just a real belief around equity that we wouldn't have equity if we allowed the leaders in the building to make decisions about how well the people in their building are doing and have those decisions reflect in the pay.
That's a very good point.
Great. But you're bringing up a really, there's another piece of this, which is the hiring piece of it, right? And just the flip side to what I'm saying is that we worked with one school organization where they had given their school leaders the freedom to make market level offers. And when we looked through their data, what we could see was their teachers, their men were getting paid more and their white men were getting paid the most. And that is because, and research would tell us this, those were the people who were best at negotiating. Mm-hmm. And so we need to put
guardrails.
Yeah.
Yep.
Structures and safeguards in place
Absolutely.
to manage that.
Well, I'm going to bring out our educators to round out the conversation. So we're going to welcome them to the middle of the conversation. And in the meantime, while they're walking out, I believe, I wanted to make sure that we're highlighting the recommendations. You've all seen the recommendations in the report, but the 4 that we're really tackling today is competitive starting pay, ensuring a living wage by front-loading the pay schedule. Please come on up. Paying more for hard-to-staff schools and subjects, and advanced teaching roles and other retention strategies. So making sure that we're thinking about those as that we head into the conversation. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So you all heard how excited I was about our first two guests. I'm equally excited about our next three guests, who were the first people we called to kind of represent the educator conversation. I love it when you can bat 1,000 on a panel and everybody you call says yes. So I hope that's a nod to the importance of this work. So I will introduce briefly, who doesn't know Xavier, right? So we have Xavier Adams. He is the NCAT 2022 Prudential North Carolina Beginning Teacher of the Year. It's a mouthful, sorry, I had to read it. He's at Orange High School in Hillsborough. Yes, I hear some snaps. And he teaches world history, honors African American studies, honors Latin American studies, and AP African American studies. And he's going to share his thoughts on how do we get teachers in the profession and not have the twice as much turnover as we have later in the career. Dr. Kim Morrison is with us from Mount Airy Schools. She has 30 years. She's a career educator. Mount Airy Schools is an advanced teaching roles district, and she's definitely a leader who wants to think outside the box, and we're so grateful to have you here. And Claudia Spencer is the Executive Director for, again, mouthful, Executive Director for Human Resources at Wilson County Schools. Jen, she's your counterpart in Wilson County. She also was 8 years as a principal in an elementary school prior to this. And that school was a restart school for the past 5 years and has been an advanced teaching role school for the last 3 years. So again, you've had some opportunities to really think outside the box. So we're really excited to have all of you with us here today. So let's start with the challenges that we went through, we kind of walked through the report with this esteemed panel. If we can put the challenges up on the board. I'd love from each of your perspectives, a beginning teacher who knows people who didn't come into the profession, people who are leaving the profession, kind of what you think of these challenges, which one strikes you as kind of most important, and so on, and then we'll move down the panel.
Thankful for everyone being here to tackle an important issue of funding public education and the teachers that are part of that work. As many of y'all know, we all go through education, and so we need good quality folks to be a part of that work. If you'll indulge me, I'm a history teacher, so I like talking a little bit about history, and since I'm not at my school today, I'm just going to share a couple of facts with us before I share my remarks. In a second here, Beston T is going to show a video talking about kind of the history of teacher pay. And there's going to be a moment talking about how in 1960, 50% of women were a part of the workforce as teachers. So a lot of them went off to college expecting to be educators. If we're looking at that same 1960 number, 45% of Southern Black people, both men and women, also went into college to be prepared to be educators. And there's a lot of history that I don't have time to unpack for that. The interesting thing is, though, that we have seen a huge decline in the number of teachers of color in our workforce. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I want to speak to the importance of why teachers of color really matter. I think a lot of times we hear we need to recruit and retain teachers of color, but we don't often get into the stories behind why that matters. And so to the point that someone mentioned earlier that you're paying for what you get, the model that we are currently invested in for public education is churning out certain outputs. Ironically with that though, we also do this weird thing in public education where so many people bring expertise to the table that we aren't actually funding and paying for. So we do this weird thing of where we say, we're going to pay for what we get, but then when we don't get a high quality product, we're kind of baffled as to why. Yet and still with that, I think if I'm thinking about my classroom, so the classes I teach deal deeply with people's personal identities. And so with that, in my classes, I have a huge range of students, low income, high income. We get some of our farmers and fishers and hunters. We get folks from a city background. And I don't get to choose who's in my classroom, but I have the opportunity to make this a classroom environment in which people can reflect meaningfully about the world around them. With that, I think we can all think about Thanksgiving that just passed away. And so many of us often think about, oh man, who's going to be at the Thanksgiving dinner table? What type of conversations are going to be had? How are we going to navigate these difficult conversations? Teachers are daily having to navigate these difficult conversations with charity, with love, with expertise, with the opportunity to offer students a new perspective. And I want to be intentional about saying not trying to change their perspective, but just offering the opportunity to see new data, to see new stories, to see new experiences, whether that's of their peers or whether that's of their teacher. And so when we're thinking about the importance of recruiting and retaining all teachers, but particularly teachers of color, that's really what is at the heart and center of that, is making sure that every student feels included in the classroom environment that they're a part of, making sure that we are adequately paying for that expertise to be retained in the classroom building. If we think about any type of consulting firm, teachers are often doing the type of work that a lot of consulting firms would love to be able to have. Someone that can facilitate difficult conversations in the classroom about big, important, challenging topics. And so I think that is, to just get the conversation going, one of the critical reasons why funding public education to retain teachers is so important.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I hear some. You're welcome to it. Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Morrison, tough act to follow, but I know you can do it.
So to add to that conversation, I think along with the access for equity of students of color and underrepresented populations, so in elementary that would be males, like you need more males going into elementary, females going into leadership. You've got to create intentional pathways. So having been in the very first class of teaching fellows, it was very intentional. And so you want to think about that kind of framework statewide to say, how do we get our best and brightest to go into education as their first choice? So how do they begin to think in the back of their mind, I'm going to be an educator no matter what? And that's where we've got to remove the barriers. We've got to give them that empowerment starting in 7th grade, most of the research says. That's when they begin to make their decision about what their career choice would be. They need to see education not as a living wage, but as a competitive wage. Very different. So you have to think about, if you want your best and brightest to choose education, what is the career ladder that they would have an opportunity to do? Because they're going to prove that they're the best. Right? We went in saying we're going to be the best, we're going to have the bluest EVOS, we're going to have every child make it. 100% of my children are going to go to college and they're going to be successful. You need that person saying, I'm going to go into education, within 3 years I'm going to move into a master teacher role, within 6 years I'm going to move into a coach. You're going to have where they continue to teach, but they lead other teachers because they're going to want to do that from the time they step on the college campus. That's a whole different mindset than let's just get to a living wage and make sure they're competitive and it's in their top 3 choices. So that takes everyone, especially I think, and we've had this conversation, what you all are doing in the industry world to say every county has to have a workforce. Strong workforce, and so those teachers are what are going to create that workforce that your county needs. So we have to invest in that because the number one factor on students graduating with a great success plan is a great teacher in every classroom.
Yeah. Love it. Bonnie.
I agree with both of you, and all of you both made some good points earlier today as well, but teacher pay challenges, I think there have always been teacher pay challenges, as both of you said. It didn't just creep up on us. It's something that we have always been dealing with. What we are now dealing with also is a teacher shortage. Mm-hmm. People, like we said, they're not going into the field of study for education. And now we're not only getting just a handful of people who have been through a teacher program, but we're also getting those who did not go that route. And so you're not only working within schools to build the capacity within your new teachers, beginning teachers who went to school to learn how to be a teacher, but you're also having to work to build capacity for people who have been in other sectors. They have done other things, they've had other careers, and somehow life has landed them to education. And they're coming in, they're not young, some of them, most of them, they're older, and they are having to learn a whole new job, and I say they're learning on the spot. It is, they are having to learn on the spot, and they need supports. They need those advanced teachers roles. They need people who are mastered, who have mastered this area, who can go in and support them and guide them. They come in and they just know they want to help kids, and that's exactly what we need. We need people who want to be there for children. However, at the same time, they don't understand what a standard course of study is. They don't understand what the content is and how to build that content so that it will get students where they need to be at the end so that they are successful. So you have to have people that are there that can support them, not just welcome, this is your stuff, this is what you need to do, this is the curriculum, go to this website, do this. They've got to have somebody who's going to step in and help them, hold their hand, guide them. I call it model for them. You know, that I'm going to show you, I'm going to model, we're going to do it together, and then you're going to do it on your own, but I'm still going to be here supporting you. And I think by working towards more advanced teaching roles so that we have people that can support beginning teachers who have been to school to do this, along with those who did not go to school to do this, but we need them as well because that's what's filling our classrooms with teachers right now.
Well, what I like about what all three of you said, I asked you to pick one and none of you were willing to, all right? I think that's fantastic, right? So if we say starting pay matters, living wage matters, competitive pay matters, right? All three matter, and you blend them together. Claudia, I'm gonna ask you because I think Wilson County has blended this idea of hard to staff with advanced teaching roles in a way that I'm not sure that I've seen in many other districts. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. In Wilson County, we started advanced teaching roles. This is our third year of actually having them, but 4 years ago, the planning began. And it was not an easy year of planning, and I was sitting as a principal at that time. I was not in HR. But going through the planning process, it was very strategic. We worked with Public Impact, and they worked not only with the district, but with each individual school who was setting up advanced teaching roles. And they helped us, and I say us, principals, they helped to guide the principals. What is it that you need for your school? At that time, I was sitting at Barnes Elementary, and at that time, we were the 6th lowest in the state. Just became a restart school last year of SIG. And I sat in a meeting and I listened to the opportunity about and what advanced teaching roles could offer. Not only teachers, but what they could offer students, because ultimately it was to reach more students, and that is the role of that. But what Wilson did was we created a tiered system, looking at your Title I schools. And those who had the most needs, for example, my school was one of those that had the most needs. We were a Tier 1 school. So the supplement, additional supplement they were getting to go into an advanced teaching role was significantly more.
Twice that of a Tier 4, right?
They could turn around and make $18,000 more a year if they were classified as the highest one, which is multi-classroom leader 3, which would have 6 to 8 teachers under them. That right there, $18,000, was a huge selling point.
Yeah.
And my mouth is getting really dry, sorry.
Oh, sorry, there's water right behind you.
Hang on one second. Well,
Yeah, and I was talking with your superintendent when we visited. He said, I have transferred teachers to that school year after year, and about a week before school starts, they leave the system, right?
that is correct.
That's the carrot approach, right? And
Right.
Or the stick approach. You took the carrot approach, and how did your number of effective teachers, how did it affect your students?
Well, what ended up happening was at the end of our first year, which was 21-22, we had implemented this. Our school exceeded growth for the first time. And that was the first time. I'm talking ever since. I'm going all the way back to when the ABC model came into play. So that was what, 2012-ish, 12, 13, somewhere in there. First time we had ever exceeded growth. The teachers that were in there, and keep in mind, we did this with only 50% of them were residents, emergency licensed, you name it. A lot of them, I mean, when I say I was looking for teachers hard, you started listening to Do You Like Children? I mean, in interviews, you were finding somebody because people didn't want to come to our school. They did not. They did not want to come to the school I was at that time. And it totally, moving into the last school year, it transitioned. It was a whole different mindset going in. Teachers had they were positive. They were excited that they were coming back to a school that could move.
Right.
I mean, now when I
Abby
say,
smiling over there because 2016, you could only have imagined hearing these stories, right?
and it was, I mean, we still have a ways to go. You know, unfortunately, we didn't exceed growth last year, but we met growth, but our proficiency grew.
Right.
And so that right there was huge. But you're talking, teachers were teaching students who had gone, some of them 2 years, and this is on top of COVID, 2 or more years without a teacher in front of them. You're talking a sub or whoever they could find to cover the space in that room.
Dr. Morrison, do you want to add anything to that conversation?
I was just going to say, having worked about a decade in an urban district, Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools, we had a similar situation. For those of you who are not aware, we've been working on performance-based compensation systems for a couple of decades. We had a teacher incentive fund in 2010, and so we had 11 schools on the state turnaround list. 10 of those came off the state turnaround list, which means they all improved. So there is a formula for improvement of schools, even those who are high poverty schools, and it is investing in teachers. We had a teacher incentive fund grant that I wrote around $19.6 million. You took 8 schools that were control schools, no performance-based compensation pay. You took 8 schools that were performance-based compensation pay, and you gave them all the literacy training, the coaches, the support that they needed, but you only paid half of those school districts. Schools. So you followed that district for 3 to 5 years, because it does take you 5 years to turn around a large school that's 1,800 or more. You can turn around a school in 3 years that's about 1,000 or less. It's the same formula. You have to have the literacy support, the science of reading, you have to have that in place with coaches to implement. You have to have the culture to change, because culture will drive change. That has to happen. So what we found at the end of that, with about a $250,000 evaluation, is that pay was not the factor that mattered. Pay is important, but it was not the factor that mattered. The factor that mattered was the whole thing together, where you have to have the culture change first, the mindset, and believe that every single child can be successful. Then you have to put the literacy support, PLCs, coaching in place to make that work so everyone's supported. And then in the performance-based compensation system, we paid everyone when they met growth. Then we paid grade levels that exceeded growth on top of that. And then the rock star teachers that are really moving the students had to get 3 times as much to see any major difference. You begin to retain those teachers. And so what we found is one of the factors that's got to change out of that study is the whole bar has to be raised to attract the teachers and retain those teachers. And so I don't know, we've talked about this, if business has the model of paying everybody a bonus if the whole school exceeds, but you also have to then pay those individual teachers as well 3 times as much to make sure they stay in that school. It's very expensive. The Reimagining Teacher Talent grant that we just received for 8 school districts across the state is all about that. And there's $21 million for 40-some schools. And you can only do the leadership stipends. You can't pay everyone in the school with that amount of money. So you do have to think about which one, according to data and research, is really taking those schools off those turnaround lists, but also taking your typically developing schools and improving them. And how do we invest in what matters? Because you can't just throw money at it without really looking at the advanced teacher role and the reimagining teacher talent across the nation to see what is actually working, and how do we make sure that every teacher gets compensated well to start with, and then we pay for the talent that we want to reimagine in those schools that need it so much.
And you raised a good point about the private sector. Jen, I'm going to pull you in on this one. She talked about, everyone gets something, and then a grade might get something, and then for high-performing teachers. How does that look compared to the private sector?
So as I mentioned earlier, there's company goals, right? So we have company metrics that fund a good chunk of our incentive plans. Mm-hmm. And then there is the individual contribution as well. I mean, incentives, employees want to know that they can control some of that, and the goals have to be obtainable. They can't just be arbitrary. They've got to be something that is obtainable. So I think a good mix, a blend is probably the best model.
Yeah. I agree. And I think oftentimes we hear it's one or the other, and there should be more and conversations, I think, than or conversations. And the private sector does blend. And can I add something I was thinking about earlier? You talked about you pay more so you can keep them. Outside of certain, and Daniel Pink talks about this, if you're in sales, you have goals to hit, you get a commission. But there are a lot of employees here at SAS, at Bain, who are marketing or accounting or whatnot, that aren't going to be driven by how many whatevers that they did. Is the goal to drive their performance, or is thinking of that kind of profession, or is the goal to retain your greatest talent who are performing at the highest levels? Abby, you can start, Jen.
Isn't that an example of an and?
Yeah.
It's both. It's both. I think, for all of this talent conversation is always attract, develop, retain, right? And compensation is a lever across all of those, but I think it is an and I think also, not everybody in the world, but lots of people are driven by goals, and goals can be, in sales it's easy, it's right, how much did you sell, but as I think about, for any profession, you can come up with a set of goals at the beginning of the year that you're trying to get to, a set of measurable goals. And then you can have conversations along the year around how you're doing against those goals and give people coaching on how they can improve. I remember I talked to a teacher once in a district, a big pay for performance district, and the teacher I was speaking with, I was doing a focus group, and it was a group of teachers who were not performing. And this one teacher said, I get evaluated 8 times a year, and I have for the last however many years, and my evaluation is always the same. And I don't know what to do with that, right? And so if you create all this time and energy around an evaluation system, but you don't use it to help people get better, then you're not taking advantage of the money that you are spending.
I hear a big takeaway there, right? And it was one of the first things when Best in C was formed, it was help fix the evaluation system. And I'm looking at the rubric and I'm saying, this looks just like mine. I mean, it was fine. But when they said they had to do it 3 times a year for 50 people, I thought, the term of art, I believe, was nuts. It's right. It's not. It is no business. It's a proxy for good management because we haven't put those support lead teachers into the system. I really appreciate this conversation, and it's about buying a change in organizational structure at this level. I do want to pull back a little, though, and talk about kind of that baseline and how are we getting teachers into the profession, and how are we keeping beginning teachers at the front end of the schedule. Like, if we can roll back to the recommendations, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how does this reflect on your spot and what you're seeing of people who are not coming to the profession and those who might be leaving early.
Absolutely. So currently the way our teacher pipeline works is, particularly with education, it starts in our classrooms with the students that we have. And we either are able to grab their imagination and captivate them with the possibility of education, falling in love with the profession, or unfortunately, we might lose some students in their interest of public education. But let's say we do grab the imagination of a student who's interested in becoming a teacher. I have a couple of students, former alumni of mine, that are now at UNC Chapel Hill, interested in becoming teachers. They're first generation college students. One of them in particular is the daughter of immigrants from Mexico. And so it was a really difficult decision for her to decide to become a public teacher, because the way our teacher pipeline works is, okay, you graduate high school, you go collect a lot of college debt, whatever prestigious university that you want to go to or local state school that you want to go to. Then you enter a profession where you're starting off at around $38K a year, and you're not even able to adequately pay off that student debt in a reasonable time, as well as being able to pursue any kind of traditional human goals that people have, whether it's start a family, buy a place of residence for themselves, being able to support loved ones as well, if we're thinking about folks that might have parents that have financial needs or grandparents. And so currently, the way our teacher pipeline works is a weird model of, okay, we're gonna grab your imagination, we're gonna sell you this message of, we would love for you to be a teacher, you can have a great impact, and then we kind of leave you to your own devices on financially making that reality possible for yourself. And so when I think about the students involved in this process, it's not just about getting teachers, it's also, when we talk about the living wage, it's about creating a realistic life trajectory for yourself, where you are able to be sustained in your profession and where you're able to be respected as well. When I think back to the student that I mentioned a second ago, being a daughter of immigrants, her parents came here for a certain reason. That's to create certain opportunities for themselves. And her older sister also went to UNC Chapel Hill, but now she's getting a doctorate in nursing. That's a very different narrative than the one of, okay, now you're gonna become a public school teacher, and thinking about what dreams are you captivating of your parents, which ones are you capitalizing on. And so there's such an immense need for this work to be able to even start the pipeline. If we're not even able to incentivize folks from low-income backgrounds to become teachers, then we really are missing out on an opportunity to get to the best and the brightest. To this point of the graphic earlier that talked about how UNC or across North Carolina, we're not retaining the top people in the class. Well, the reality is the top people of our class are also folks from low-income backgrounds.
That's right.
And so we need to do something to be able to incentivize them to come into this work as well.
I have to speak to that because I was first generation to go to college, and then my aunts went after I did. So I hear that very loud and clear, that had they not had a teaching fellow in place, I would not have been able to go to college. My dad was clear about that. And so it affects everyone. And how do we remove those barriers? And I think statewide we have to think together to do that. I don't think you can do that in pockets.
Yeah, I agree. And you talked about 7th grade, right? When we look at the data on the population of North Carolina with a bachelor's degree, our teachers not all of our teachers of color, our white and our black teachers actually mimic those numbers fairly well. It's the Latino population that really does not. So then I think, well, that's the pool, right? So I think what I'm hearing from you is you have to grow the pool, not of pulling from existing bachelor's degree owners, but how do you in 7th grade find someone and pull them into the profession who will go to college. You were just talking about this, Abby, backstage. How will this pull you into the profession? It will pull you into college because of the profession, and not we're pulling you into the profession from college. Mm-hmm. So, and does compensation matter in that conversation? I mean, how much? And you mentioned 37. In fairness, we're now at 39 plus 41 next year. We have local supplements. And so now part of that's a communication issue. I talked with a young woman who she thought teachers in Wake County made $30,000. With their supplement, they're approaching 50 first year teaching. Is there some messaging that we need to do? Right? What can you say to speak to that? Because if our teachers are walking around saying it's 37 and it's not in most counties, how do we deal? Well, it's not in any county now, but how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think speaking about pay in general can be taboo, but then when you particularly lay that on top of a profession that's often viewed as being a public servant, people shy away from that conversation of wanting to talk about pay. And so I think, like most things in the high school setting, so as a high school teacher, we're so accustomed to, okay, we're gonna get these students ready to apply for college, we're gonna get them aware of what the FAFSA looks like for themselves. And so we hold these intentional sessions where we give them the information that they need to make informed decisions about college. The same thing applies for teachers. What are the opportunities that we're creating to make informed decisions about what we're doing, and just spreading general awareness? I think as a teacher, I'm constantly thinking about, okay, what do I need to grade? what student wasn't there the previous day that I need to be able to catch them up on their missing work. There's so many responsibilities. What parents do I need to call home about whatever's going on in the classroom, whether it's sharing the positive things that are going on or some student behavior that needs to be addressed. And there's so many individual things that we have in our classrooms going on that to receive that information is always on the back burner. I think as teachers, we're always putting our students first. And so just in general, better strategic placing of information
What Dr.
would be
Morrison just
critical.
said, be more
I mean-
strategic about it, right?
Preach on that, you know. So, being the daughter of a Baptist minister, so it sounds like a preaching to me. But I think you really do have to think about being intentional. I think that's what you're hearing today. You know, if we want lateral entry, we can attract lateral entry into education. We had a large grant with UNC Greensboro that took some scientists from NASA and brought them into the classroom. They paid for their certification, they paid for their master's, they were required to stay for 5 years, and one of them ended up winning the beginning teacher of the year in Guilford County and just made a huge impact, right? That's very intentional, money around that, bringing experts in math and science in the classroom. You can do that. They want to get out of the rat race sometimes, and they're ready to give back. Then you have this pool that we're talking about at high school and college who really do want to be teachers but don't know how they could afford it, and they don't understand. They want to make the impact. I mean, this group of students graduating from high school right now don't care as much about pay as they do making a difference. You should interview them, survey them, you will see that. They move from job to job not because they want more pay, but because they don't feel fulfilled, right? So how do we, in the 7th grade and 8th grade and 9th grade, say this is the biggest field that can impact the next generation? We want to pay you a competitive wage to stay in this field, and look at what we could do in our own county. You know, we're growing our own students. We're having internships and apprenticeships. Our high schools are small college campuses, but the teachers at the college and the high school are the reason these students are coming out of high school with all these certifications, with all these apprenticeship opportunities. And 80% of our hospital are keeping our apprentices in Surrey County because of Surrey Yadkin Works. It's intentional, and it's teachers. Teachers are the main reason that students succeed. Number one reason in every research point that you see. So how are we more intentional? How do we put the money statewide? And how do we make up for equity across the state? Where students of poverty do not get those opportunities that we may get in Mount Airy. And what are the grants that can be guaranteed so that they're not all competitive, so that we can do this together? It's really important work, and I'm very thankful that you're working on it. I think this is the 4th panel in which I've spoken in the last month, so it's a hot topic.
Well, and 4 years ago, here at the Innovation Lab, we were talking about NC Stride, which was sort of everything but comp, and now we're comp and nothing else, right? And one of the topics was we are struggling to recruit candidates, particularly candidates of color and male candidates, because of information. You said it very early in your conversation, and Teach NC came out of that work. It came out of an innovation lab. So when we ask you to come here, it's to generate those kinds of ideas. And last year, 1,700 candidates came through Teach NC because their questions were answered, they got the information that they needed, and 50% were candidates of color. So everyone here, as we head into breakout sessions, you're contributing to these ideas and that intentionality. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to move to audience questions in just one moment, so be thinking. But I do want to give you a chance. Is there something burning in your mind, the educators, private sector, like to each other, that you'd like to follow up on before we move?
I think we have to, I agree with exactly what you said. We have got to promote education, because that is one thing that is not occurring to the extent that it needs to occur. But I think we also need to show, like in Wilson, we have, our advanced teaching roles, you have them. That is a major recruitment piece, but we also need to take that in. When you become a teacher, like if you go to school and you become a teacher, that's not the only thing, that's not your stopping point. You can still lead. You can lead as a teacher. This is how you can lead. This is how you can serve a different variety of people. But just making sure that we're sharing that, and together we also need to look at how are we going to create this so that it's not just advanced teaching roles in your Title I, low-performing schools, schools of need. How are we going to do that so that it is also, and those schools who don't qualify as Title I, because they still have a major need in there?
Well, this year we had $10.9 million put in the budget to do just that. And the number, when you scale it up to statewide, so we can fund those positions statewide, is $200 million. So legislators who are here, thank you. This was the first time you made a major investment in the advanced teaching role stipends. 85% of our current ATR schools are Title I because they have Title I funds to fund that with. And for the state to do that, and then for Title I schools to be able to layer that money on top so you can have that twice stipend in your Title I schools, it's really, really exciting. And the state has, and Abby, you said that, Abby flew from California in part because this is the state that's doing it, right? This is the state that has said, we want to change this entire organizational structure.
And we have to make sure we sustain it. We just can't do it.
Recurring funds.
We have to continue with it.
That's right.
We can't stop.
I agree.
And how do we get more
I know.
Xaviers
Right.
out there who are great role models, teacher of color, young, exciting, and smart? I think we have to have a lot of missionaries out there working and saying the same thing you're saying today. And it needs to come from you who are just beginning to teach to say, I wouldn't choose anything else. And here's why I'm in this role, and here's why it matters. And I think if we have a lot of you, one of you in each school, we'll be good to go.
Brenda, if I
Yes.
can I add, you asked if we would add anything. I just wanted to give you all kudos because in 2015 we were doing this research around distributed leadership, and we looked around the country and we saw these little tiny pockets, and we talked to some people who were visionaries and had this big idea. Some of those people were here in Charlotte that we talked to, and it's a big idea, and it's really hard work. It's really hard work. And people sort of recognized that it was a big and good idea, but that it was also really hard work. And so, we wrote this paper and we went around and we talked about it, and then sort of got quiet. And then you sent me a report, I don't know, 2 years ago?
Thank you, Chris.
And lo and behold, North Carolina had done this thing. And this thing that is really hard, and you have actual evidence that it is working. And I'm just sitting here reflecting on this conversation, which is, talking about teacher comp is hard, and this is a nuanced conversation. And it's just so exciting to me because I have this really amazing job where I get to see all across the country and really all across the world. And I'm just so impressed with the work that you all have done. And your ability to have the long view and to make the investment around things that really work. So I'm just so grateful to be here today. So thank you
for that. Well, I'd love to wrap there, but I do want to hear questions. So other questions from the audience? Matt Smith.
Hey, so thank you for the panelists. I'm a principal in Edgecombe County. Have been in Edgecombe County for 26 years. Testing?
Yes.
All right, great. So principal from Edgecombe County, been as a classroom teacher for 16 years, in the current school I'm at as a principal for 10 years. My number one job, obviously, is school safety. My second job is supporting the students and staff at our school, right? That's where the magic gets done. My role has changed in many ways for our teachers over the last few years in terms of the kinds of supports that I've had to offer. I have had to call property managers to assure them that teachers can pay their bills because they don't have the income to rent ratio that is necessary for them to get housing. I have had to work with teachers to find meaningful summer employment because they didn't want to stock shelves at Food Line to pay their bills. And those are just kind of like a couple stories off the cuff. And so the reason I'm sharing this is that I want to ask if the conversation we're having today is truly strategic about what's best for education in North Carolina, or if it's existential. I want to ask if what we're really talking about is how to improve a system, or if it's how to save a system. And I wondered if you could speak to that.
Great point. I would just say we're in a crisis, so we've been in save mode because of the lack of folks who are applying and going into some of those positions. But we need to move to a reimagining the teacher talent is what we need to move to, right? What does that look like? What would principals should come together statewide and say, these are the things that we could do that would really matter? The competitive wage is absolutely first step across the board. We know that. But then the opportunities for career ladder improvement has to be right after that. So for everyone, if you are growing students and you're taking on leadership roles, you should get compensated for that. But not only compensation, we also have to change the culture and the respect for teaching across the state. It has to be the number one reason that people want to go to college. And we as a community have to put teachers at the top of our list of respect. That is one of the biggest problems we have right now. You can pay them as much as you want to, but if their community doesn't see them as the leader in their classroom and the leader in their community, we'll never attract them. So we've got to do a better job of talking positively about teachers from every venue, especially from industry, to say they are the number one thing we'll need to develop workforce development in this county. That's just my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, and adding to that, I completely agree. We have to reimagine, as Dr. Morrison is saying. If we think about the last couple of years and just the way that teachers are hemorrhaging out of the system, I think a lot of times when we see those numbers, we don't realize how many teachers almost left with that, right? The extra layer of teachers that we've kind of just duct taped to stay in place, but those teachers are also on the fence of, wow, I'm recognizing that, my peers left. It actually looks like a good idea to leave. And so we haven't seen those numbers leave yet, but I know in my conversations with peers across the state that there are teachers that are always on the fence every day about, is this something that's the best decision for my family? And to bring this back to the students and why this matters so much, not just for the teachers like myself, but the students in our classroom, when you have a high teacher turnover rate, that's going to drastically impact the culture that we need to build in our classrooms, in our school buildings, in our districts, to be able to actually offer a stellar education for our students so that they can be able to propel themselves into the life opportunities that they want. So I think you're exactly right, Matt, with what you're saying.
And landing on the student, that's perfect, thank you. Matt, to your point about kind of the strategic, when you go into the next thing we're doing is the breakout sessions. We'll have a short break and we'll go into our breakout sessions in role-alike mode. You have a little sticker telling you which room to go to. The first thing the facilitators are going to walk you through is, what does this cost? What are the specifics, right? It's nice enough to say, raise the floor, but what does that mean? What is that number? What are we going for? So that will be the first part of the conversation. And then you have an opportunity. So all of these questions and ideas that you're generating, this is your opportunity to sort of unpack those in this breakout session, which is role-alike, and in the afternoon will be topical. And that video you talked about will be right after lunch, our world premiere of our teacher pay video. We have Catherine Truitt and Rick Hess speaking before we go into those breakout sessions. And of course, you all get a free copy of Rick's new book. Wow, I told you this is the most exciting panel I've ever been on, because it's not a panel. This is a conversation, and such incredible expertise. We're so grateful to have you here. I'm so grateful that all of you were able to engage. Let's give a round of applause to our friends.